March 6, 1944. The air temperature at 30,000 feet above Europe registered a bone-numbing -45 degrees Fahrenheit. Lieutenant James Harrison's oxygen mask had partially frozen to his face during the 3-hour flight from England, but his attention wasn't on the discomfort. His eyes scanned the distant horizon where Berlin lay shrouded in early morning haze. The P-51 Mustang beneath him hummed with lethal precision, its Merlin engine gulping fuel from the drop tanks that had made this unprecedented mission possible. Falcon leader to all units, "We're approaching Berlin airspace," he spoke calmly into the radio. "Remember your training. Today we make history." Behind him stretched a formation of over 800 American bombers, flying fortresses and liberators, carrying thousands of pounds of explosives intended for German aircraft factories and military installations. What made this day different, what made this day revolutionary, was that for the first time single-engine fighters would escort these bombers all the way to the German capital and back. The men in the bombers had nicknamed these escort fighters their little friends, but there was nothing little about the task they faced today, or the impact their presence would have on the course of the war. Harrison's mind drifted briefly to the morning briefing, where Colonel Blakesley had outlined the audacious plan. The intelligence officer had pointed to the map of Europe, his wooden pointer tapping on Berlin. "The Germans believe their capital is beyond the reach of our fighters. They're wrong, and today they'll learn how wrong." The room had fallen silent, the magnitude of the mission sinking in. Pilots exchanged glances, some excited, others apprehensive. This wasn't just another escort mission. This was a deliberate provocation, a challenge issued to the heart of the Third Reich. The P-51 Mustang, with its distinctive bubble canopy and sleek profile, was a technological marvel that few had fully appreciated until now. Its Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, produced under license by Packard in America, gave it exceptional high-altitude performance, but it was the aircraft's remarkable fuel efficiency, combined with drop tanks, that truly changed the strategic equation. For the first time, American fighters could reach any target in the Reich, and the Germans would learn this fact today in the most painful way possible. The sound of aircraft engines filled the March skies, a mechanical symphony playing over the heart of Nazi Germany. This was a sound no one in Berlin had expected to hear. American fighters this deep into Reich territory. The Luftwaffe had built its entire defensive strategy around the assumption that enemy fighter escorts would turn back hundreds of miles before reaching Berlin, leaving the bomber formations vulnerable. For years, that assumption had held true. The P-47 Thunderbolts and P-38 Lightnings simply lacked the range. But the Mustang changed everything. With its aerodynamic design, fuel-efficient Merlin engine, and external drop tanks, the P-51 could now reach beyond the German capital, and the Americans had kept this capability deliberately quiet, waiting for the perfect moment to spring their trap. The skies over Berlin had long been the exclusive domain of the Luftwaffe, a sanctuary from which they could launch their interceptors against unescorted bombers. Today, that sanctuary would be violated, and the psychological impact would be as devastating as the physical losses. Colonel Donald Blakesley, commander of the 4th Fighter Group, had meticulously planned this mission. "Let them think we can't reach Berlin," he'd told his pilots during briefing. "Let them concentrate their fighters there. Then we'll show them what these Mustangs can really do." The strategy was not merely to protect the bombers, though that remained the primary objective. The deeper aim was to lure the Luftwaffe's best remaining pilots into the air over their capital, where they would face an enemy they hadn't prepared for, American fighters with full ammunition and fuel reserves. It was a calculated plan to bleed the German Air Force dry of its experienced pilots, who were already in critically short supply. The once mighty Luftwaffe, which had terrorized Europe during the Blitzkrieg years, was now a dwindling force. Fuel shortages, the demands of multiple fronts, and the relentless Allied bombing campaign had steadily eroded its strength. But its mystique remained, particularly over the skies of Berlin, which had never seen American fighters. That mystique would end today. Harrison checked his watch, 10:43 a.m. The bombers had been flying since dawn, their crews enduring the monotonous hours at high altitude, where every movement was slowed by cold and the need to conserve oxygen. He imagined their relief at seeing the Mustang still with them as they approached the target. In previous deep penetration raids, bomber crews had watched helplessly as their fighter escorts turned back, leaving them alone to face the concentrated fury of the Luftwaffe. The psychological effect of that abandonment had been devastating, contributing to the astronomical loss rates suffered in raids like the infamous Black Thursday mission to Schweinfurt in October 1943, when 60 B-17s, nearly a quarter of the force, had been lost. Today would be different. Today, the bombers would feel the reassuring presence of their little friends all the way to the target and back, and the Luftwaffe would face a nasty surprise. The first signs of German resistance appeared as dark specks against the blue sky. Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf 190s climbing frantically to intercept the bomber formation. The German pilots were expecting to find unescorted bombers as they had on previous deep penetration raids. The shock on their faces would be invisible at this distance, but Harrison could imagine it clearly enough. "Tally-ho! Bandits at 2 o'clock high," Lieutenant Williams called over the radio. "Jesus, there's dozens of them." Harrison checked his instruments and tightened his grip on the control stick. "Falcon Squadron, drop tanks now," he ordered, his voice betraying no emotion. The squadron jettisoned their external fuel tanks in perfect unison, transformed in an instant from long-range escorts to nimble fighters. The sleek Mustangs, relieved of their extra burden, became even more responsive. Harrison felt the aircraft leap forward as he pushed the throttle, the Merlin engine's distinctive roar changing pitch as it delivered full combat power. The freezing air tore at Harrison's P-51 as he pushed the throttle forward and pulled into a steep climb. Below him, the bomber formation continued its relentless path toward Berlin, flying straight and level, despite the bursting flak. The Luftwaffe pilots, focused entirely on the bombers, didn't notice the American fighters until it was too late. Harrison rolled in behind a Bf-109, whose pilot was setting up for an attack on the lead bomber group. The German was so intent on his target that he never saw death approaching from his 6 o'clock position. Harrison's 6.50 caliber machine guns roared to life, sending tracers streaking through the sky. The 109 shuddered under the impact, black smoke pouring from its engine before it rolled over and plunged toward the earth 20,000 feet below. He didn't watch it fall. Combat wasn't about counting kills or savoring victories. It was about survival and mission accomplishment. Harrison immediately scanned the sky for his next opponent, aware that in aerial combat, the greatest danger often came from the enemy you didn't see. Across the sky, other Mustang pilots engaged the surprised Luftwaffe fighters. The Americans held every advantage: altitude, surprise, and fuel. The Germans had expected to fight bombers, not escort fighters over their own capital. Their tactics, honed for attacking bomber formations, fell apart in the face of the agile Mustangs. Major James Howard, leading another group of Mustangs, found himself alone in the midst of 30 German fighters. Rather than retreat, he attacked, swirling through the enemy formation with such aggression and skill that he disrupted their entire attack pattern, shooting down 4 and damaging several others. His solo defense of the bombers would later earn him the Medal of Honor. Howard's P-51, which he had named Ding Hao, Chinese for very good, became a symbol of the Mustang's dominance. The bomber crews who witnessed his one-man stand against overwhelming odds would never forget the sight of a single Mustang darting among the German fighters, scattering them like startled birds. The battle splintered into dozens of individual dogfights scattered across the sky. Harrison lost track of time as he maneuvered his Mustang through a 3-dimensional chess game where the stakes were life and death. He downed a second Bf-109 and damaged a Focke-Wulf before breaking off to rejoin his squadron. The cockpit was numbingly cold, despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. Berlin now lay below them, partially obscured by smoke, as the bombers released their payloads on German aircraft factories. Harrison could see buildings crumbling, fires erupting across the industrial districts, but his focus remained on the sky around him, where Luftwaffe reinforcements continued to arrive, thrown desperately into battle by German commanders who couldn't believe American fighters had reached their capital. The radio chatter was constant now, a mixture of terse combat reports, warnings about enemy positions, and occasional whoops of triumph. "Falcon 3, you've got one on your tail. Break right, break right. Got him, scratch one more 109. The coordinated formation flying that had brought them to Berlin had dissolved into the chaotic ballet of air combat, where individual skill and split-second decisions determined who lived and who died. "They're launching everything they've got," Captain Reynolds observed over the radio. "That's exactly what we want," came Colonel Blakesley's confident reply. "Keep them engaged. Force them to fight." This was the true objective, not just protecting the bombers, but drawing out the Luftwaffe's best remaining pilots and decimating them. Each experienced German pilot lost today represented months of training and irreplaceable combat knowledge. The Americans understood what the Germans were only beginning to realize. Their superiority wasn't just about protecting your aircraft or destroying enemy planes. It was about systematically eliminating the human expertise that made an effective air force possible. Harrison spotted a Bf-109 attempting to disengage from the battle, diving away toward the safety of the clouds below. He rolled his Mustang inverted and pulled into a diving pursuit. The 109 pilot was good, probably a veteran of the Eastern Front, but the Mustang's superior diving speed left him no chance. Harrison closed the range rapidly, his tracers walking across the German fighter's wing route and into its cockpit. The 109 exploded spectacularly, pieces of burning wreckage tumbling through the sky. That was 3 confirmed kills today, making Harrison an ace in a single mission. In a windowless bunker below Berlin, Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring received increasingly desperate reports as the air battle unfolded. "American fighters over Berlin? Impossible," he shouted at his staff officers. But the radio transmissions from dying Luftwaffe pilots confirmed the unthinkable truth. "They're everywhere," one veteran squadron leader reported before his transmission abruptly ended. "Mustangs. Long range. We weren't prepared." Göring's face reddened with rage and fear. He had personally assured Hitler that American fighters could never reach this far. Now that assurance was being shot down along with his best remaining pilots. In that moment, though he wouldn't admit it publicly for many months, Göring knew the air war was lost. "When I saw Mustangs over Berlin," he would later confess, "I knew the jig was up." The once proud commander of the Luftwaffe, who had boasted that his fighters would prevent a single enemy bomb from falling on the Reich, now faced the ultimate humiliation. Not only were American bombers pounding Berlin in daylight, but American fighters were shooting down his pilots over the capital itself. Hitler would be furious, and Göring's position, already precarious after years of failed promises, would become even more tenuous. The air battle continued for nearly 30 minutes, an eternity in combat time. Lieutenants Parker and Rodriguez from Harrison's squadron failed to return, but the toll on the Luftwaffe was far worse. German fighters fell from the sky in unprecedented numbers, many piloted by instructor pilots hastily called from training schools, a desperate measure that would have long-term consequences for the Luftwaffe's ability to generate new pilots. The remaining German fighters, low on fuel and ammunition, finally broke off the engagement. The bomber formation, though bloodied, had delivered its payload. Factories that had been producing Focke-Wulf fighters that morning were now burning ruins. And most importantly, dozens of Germany's irreplaceable veteran pilots lay dead in the forests and fields surrounding Berlin. The strategic calculus of the air war had shifted dramatically in those 30 minutes. Before today, the Germans had hoped that their new jet fighters, the Me-262, might eventually restore their control of the skies. But jets without trained pilots were useless, and the Luftwaffe's training pipeline had just been severely compromised. Harrison checked his fuel gauges. The long journey home still lay ahead, and the Mustang's impressive range would be tested to its limits without the drop tanks. "Falcon squadron, form up on me," he ordered, watching as the surviving fighters of his unit slid into formation. They would rendezvous with fresh P-47 Thunderbolts near the German border, which would take over escort duties for the final leg home. But the critical mission, escorting bombers all the way to Berlin and engaging the Luftwaffe's best, had been accomplished. As they turned westward, Harrison took a final glance at the smoke rising from Berlin. Something fundamental had changed in the air war today. The Germans had lost more than aircraft and pilots. They had lost the security of their own airspace. The psychological impact would be profound, not just for the Luftwaffe, but for the entire German war effort. Berlin, the heart of the Third Reich, was now demonstrably vulnerable. Its defenders could no longer protect it, even on their home ground with every advantage. The myth of German invincibility, already cracking after defeats on the Eastern Front, had suffered another devastating blow. As they flew westward, Harrison thought of the faces at briefing that morning. Young men like himself, most barely into their 20s, undertaking a mission that would reshape the air war. Lieutenant Wilson, with his Oklahoma drawl and constant talk of his fiancée back home. Sergeant Peterson, the crew chief who had worked through the night to ensure Harrison's P-51 was in perfect condition. Captain Thomas, the intelligence officer who had meticulously outlined the German defenses they would face. How many of them understood the historic significance of what they had just accomplished? Perhaps it was better that they didn't, that they focused on the immediate tasks of flying, fighting, and surviving rather than the weight of history. The freezing air at high altitude had a way of simplifying things, reducing life to its essential elements. You flew your aircraft, protected your comrades, accomplished your mission, and tried to make it home. The bigger picture, the strategic implications, Those were concerns for generals and historians. The flight back to England was tense but uneventful. German fighter opposition had been so thoroughly destroyed over Berlin that few rose to challenge the withdrawing American formation. Harrison's squadron landed at their base in East Anglia, just as dusk was settling over the English countryside. His muscles ached as he climbed down from the cockpit, his flight suit stiff with frozen sweat. Ground crews gathered around the returning pilots, eager for details of the historic mission. "How was Berlin?" a young mechanic asked Harrison. The pilot paused before answering, removing his leather flying helmet. "Cold," he said finally, "but not as cold as it was for the Luftwaffe." The debriefing lasted hours, with intelligence officers meticulously recording every detail of the engagement. How many enemy aircraft had each pilot engaged? What types? What tactics had the Germans employed? How had they reacted to the Mustang's presence? The full picture that emerged was even more impressive than Harrison had realized during the chaotic battle. The 4th Fighter Group alone had claimed over 50 German aircraft destroyed for the loss of only a handful of Mustangs, an exchange ratio that the dwindling Luftwaffe could not sustain. That night, in the officers' mess, the celebration was subdued. Too many empty chairs reminded them of the cost of victory. Lieutenant Parker had been Harrison's roommate, a quiet, thoughtful man from Maine who had been writing a novel in his spare time. Rodriguez had been the squadron comedian, always ready with a joke to break the tension before missions. They were gone now. Their personal effects would be collected and sent home, their names added to the growing list of those who had given their lives to defeat the Nazi war machine. The surviving pilots drank to their memory, sharing stories that transformed the dead from statistics back into the young men they had been. This was a side of war that the newspapers and newsreels back home never captured. The quiet grief that accompanied even the most successful missions, the knowledge that each victory was purchased with irreplaceable human lives. Yet there was pride too, a deep satisfaction in knowing that their sacrifices and those of their fallen comrades had not been in vain. They had struck a decisive blow today, one that would hasten the end of the war and ultimately save countless lives. In the days that followed, American and British intelligence officers pieced together the true impact of what came to be known as Black Monday for the Luftwaffe. The Germans had lost over 60 fighters and, more critically, dozens of their most experienced pilots. But the psychological impact far exceeded even these severe losses. The myth of an impenetrable Reich had been shattered. If American fighters could reach Berlin, no target in Germany was safe. The Luftwaffe leadership frantically revised their defensive tactics, but the damage was done. They now faced an impossible dilemma: continue to defend their capital and industrial centers, knowing they would face Mustangs as well as bombers, or conserve their dwindling force of trained pilots and cede air superiority entirely. General Adolf Galland, the Luftwaffe's fighter commander, later admitted that this was the moment he knew the air war was lost. "The appearance of long-range Mustangs over Berlin was our worst nightmare realized," he wrote in his post-war memoirs. "It meant there was nowhere in the Reich our pilots could fight without facing superior Allied fighters." The strategic implications were devastating. The Americans and British immediately recognized the significance of the breakthrough. General Jimmy Doolittle, commander of the 8th Air Force, implemented a new strategy that played to the Mustang's strengths. No longer would fighters be limited to close escort of bombers. Now they would sweep ahead of bomber formations, actively seeking Luftwaffe fighters and destroying them wherever found, even at their airfields. "The best way to protect our bombers is to eliminate enemy fighters before they can take off," Doolittle declared. The hunter had become the hunted, and the Mustang was the perfect predator. Its combination of range, speed, and maneuverability made it the most lethal aircraft in the European theater. The new strategy, revolutionary in its aggression, transformed the air war from a defensive struggle to protect bombers into an offensive campaign to destroy the Luftwaffe as a fighting force. Bomber losses plummeted, while German fighter losses soared. The Mustang pilots, emboldened by their success over Berlin, attacked German airfields with growing confidence, catching aircraft on the ground and strafing them as they attempted to take off or land. The Luftwaffe, which had once ruled the skies over Europe, was being systematically dismantled. March gave way to April, and the air offensive intensified. P-51 pilots began to rack up impressive tallies of enemy aircraft destroyed. The 4th Fighter Group, pioneers of the Berlin mission, became the first American unit to destroy over 1,000 enemy aircraft. Across Europe, the balance of power in the skies shifted decisively. German industrial production, despite Albert Speer's desperate efforts, could not replace aircraft as quickly as they were being destroyed. More significantly, the Luftwaffe's training program collapsed under the pressure. New German pilots with fewer than 50 hours of flight time were being sent against American pilots who had hundreds of hours of training and increasing combat experience. The results were predictably one-sided. The quality gap between the two air forces widened into an unbridgeable chasm. By May, even Luftwaffe aces with hundreds of kills to their credit, mostly achieved on the Eastern Front, found themselves outclassed by average American pilots flying Mustangs. The technological superiority of the P-51, combined with better trained pilots and more fuel for training and operations, created an overwhelming advantage that no amount of German courage or desperation could overcome. As spring gave way to early summer, the Allies prepared for the invasion of France. The success of the D-Day landings would depend heavily on air superiority, the ability to prevent German reinforcements from reaching the beachhead. Thanks in large part to the Mustang and the tactics pioneered during missions like the Berlin raid, this superiority was now absolute. The Luftwaffe had been driven from the skies over Western Europe, its remaining strength hoarded for the desperate defense of the Reich itself. When Allied forces stormed ashore on June 6, 1944, they did so under a protective umbrella of air power that was unprecedented in military history. German attempts to attack the invasion beaches from the air were pitifully ineffective. Only 2 Luftwaffe aircraft managed to reach the beachhead on D-Day, testament to how thoroughly the German Air Force had been defeated. The Mustang's role in this victory cannot be overstated. Its arrival at a critical juncture in the air war, combined with innovative tactics and the skill of its pilots, had turned the tide. The long-range fighter had done what many military theorists thought impossible. It had proven that bombers didn't always get through, but with the right escort, they could deliver a knockout blow to the industrial heart of an enemy nation. Lieutenant Harrison survived the war, flying over 70 combat missions before returning home in August 1944. His P-51, which he had named Betty Jane after his wife, carried him through some of the most intense aerial combat in history. Years later, when asked about his most memorable mission, he always pointed to that March day over Berlin. "We changed the war that day," he would say simply, "not just by protecting the bombers, but by showing the Germans that nowhere was beyond our reach." Once they knew that, something broke in them. You could see it in the way they fought afterward. They knew they couldn't win. Harrison's experience was multiplied across thousands of American and Allied pilots who flew the Mustang. Together, they achieved what many had thought impossible at the start of the war: complete dominance of the skies over enemy territory. The cost had been high, with thousands of pilots lost, but the strategic impact was undeniable. The Mustang had transformed the air war from a costly battle of attrition to a decisive campaign of annihilation, paving the way for the Allied victory in Europe. The legacy of the P-51 Mustang and the strategy it enabled extends far beyond World War II. The concept of air superiority as a prerequisite for successful military operations has become a cornerstone of modern warfare. The lessons learned in the skies over Berlin about range, tactical flexibility, and the integration of fighters and bombers continue to influence military aviation to this day. But perhaps the most enduring lesson is about adaptation and innovation in warfare. The Mustang itself was born from necessity, a fusion of American airframe design and British engine technology created to meet an urgent battlefield requirement. Its success reminds us that in war, as in life, it is not always the strongest who survive, but those most responsive to change. The Germans, for all their technical brilliance, failed to anticipate the threat posed by long-range escort fighters until it was too late. The Allies, facing devastating losses in the strategic bombing campaign, found a solution that transformed defeat into victory. That solution, the P-51 Mustang, stands as one of the most successful examples of military innovation in history. As the cold dawn breaks over the runway at the Imperial War Museum in Duxford, England, a restored P-51 Mustang sits gleaming in the early light. Its polished aluminum skin reflects the rising sun, and its distinctive profile is unmistakable, even to those with only a passing interest in military aircraft. Painted on its fuselage is the name Berlin Express, a homage to the Mustangs that changed the course of the air war. For the veterans who once flew these magnificent machines, and the few who remain to tell their tales, this aircraft represents more than just aviation technology. It represents a turning point in history, a moment when human ingenuity and courage combined to overcome seemingly impossible odds. The story of how the Americans used the P-51's range to lure the Luftwaffe into a single-day air massacre over Berlin deserves to be remembered not just as a tale of aerial combat, but as a testament to what determined people can achieve when failure is not an option. In the darkest hours of the war, when Allied bomber losses threatened to make the strategic air campaign unsustainable, the Mustang arrived to change the equation completely. It stands as a reminder that in war, as in all human endeavors, seemingly intractable problems often yield to unexpected solutions. If you've enjoyed this journey through one of aviation history's pivotal moments, consider visiting air museums where these magnificent warbirds are preserved, or supporting organizations dedicated to keeping the memory of the greatest generation alive. The sacrifices made by young men in the frigid skies over Europe ensured freedoms we often take for granted today. Their stories of courage, innovation, and perseverance against overwhelming odds, remain as relevant now as they were in 1944. The P-51 Mustang may have been made of aluminum and steel, but its true strength came from the indomitable human spirit of those who designed, built, maintained, and flew it into battle. That spirit continues to inspire us, reminding us that even the darkest winter eventually gives way to spring. The lessons of the Berlin Air Battle about strategic innovation, technological adaptation, and human courage transcend their historical context. They speak to universal truths about conflict and resilience that remain valuable in our own challenging times. As we face our own seemingly insurmountable obstacles, we would do well to remember how a seemingly simple innovation, extending the range of fighter aircraft, changed the course of history and helped secure victory in humanity's greatest conflict. The Berlin Air Battle of March 6, 1944, known as Black Monday to the Luftwaffe, marked the beginning of the end for German air power. The arrival of the P-51 Mustang over Berlin signaled a fundamental shift in the strategic balance. No longer could the Germans count on the sanctuary of distance. No longer could they concentrate their dwindling fighter force against unescorted bombers. The psychological impact was perhaps even greater than the material losses. German pilots, who had once ruled the skies over Europe with unchallenged confidence, now faced an enemy who could meet them on equal or superior terms anywhere in the Reich. The morale effect was devastating. As one captured Luftwaffe pilot admitted, "When we saw Mustangs over Berlin, we knew we were fighting a losing battle." The sound of American fighters over the capital, once unthinkable, became a psychological weapon in itself, a constant reminder to the German population that Allied air power had achieved complete domination of their skies. From Black Monday forward, there would be no respite, no sanctuary, no hope of turning the tide in the air war. The Mustang had sealed the fate of the Luftwaffe, and with it, the ultimate outcome of the conflict in Europe. In the annals of military aviation, few aircraft have achieved the legendary status of the North American P-51 Mustang. Its distinctive silhouette, the elegant teardrop canopy, the graceful fuselage, the powerful lines suggesting speed even at rest, has become an icon of American industrial might and fighting spirit. But beyond its aesthetic appeal, the Mustang represents something more profound, the decisive technological innovation that turned the tide of the air war in Europe. When we contemplate the vast, complex struggle that was World War II, with its countless battles, technologies, and human dramas, the story of the P-51 Mustang stands out as a uniquely clear example of how a single weapon system could fundamentally alter strategic realities. The Berlin Air Battle of March 1944 was not merely another dogfight, not merely another bombing raid. It was the moment when the Luftwaffe's fate was sealed, when the myth of German aerial invincibility was shattered once and for all, and when the long road to Allied victory became irrevocably shorter.